Creativity is a social experience. You're not creative alone.
Despite its struggles, ESG can overcome the criticism and help make companies more accountable towards all stakeholders.
Today we're going to talk about things like trust and teams,
Bitcoin, blockchain, cryptocurrencies.
Hello and welcome to this 13th RESKILL Masterclass. Today we welcome Klaus Miller, professor in the HEC Marketing Department, and he's also the chairholder for the study of artificial intelligence at HEC Paris. Today he'll be discussing with all of us the question of data in advertising. More specifically, Klaus, you will be studying the risks and benefits of the massive consumer data that internet has brought us. You'll be suggesting ideas on how to manage this new phenomenon and with it the inevitable questions of privacy. After your presentation, Klaus, you'll be answering questions and remarks that we've been receiving from all of our viewers. Klaus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And let's start with a simple but striking fact. Every time you visit a website, let's say Le Monde in France, The Guardian in the UK, or YouTube, hundreds of advertisers may be bidding for your attention. This process takes place in less than a blink of an eye. It's invisible to all of us. It happens constantly every time you visit a website. And this process is called a real-time advertising auction for our attention. Essentially, this process funds the internet as we have been accustomed to. And it also raises a fundamental question, which is at what cost? Who benefits and who loses if data becomes the backbone of digital media? That's the question of today's masterclass. So let's take a step back and think about the magnitude of this online advertising system. So global advertising amounts to $1 trillion, and about 2/3 of that number go to digital channels. So digital advertising is not a niche thing anymore. It's actually the backbone of the online economy. And at the core of the system is user data. User data is tracked by cookies, for example, or device IDs. It's traded, it's analyzed, and the idea is to determine who to target with ads and how much to pay for these ads. So when we talk about data and advertising, we essentially also have to talk about how the internet is funding for itself. Before we started this masterclass, we asked some of you about a quick pulse check. We wanted to know, who do you think actually benefits the most and who loses in this trillion-dollar data economy? So many of you think that, for example, big tech platforms and major publishers benefit the most, followed by advertisers, and consumers, for example, or society at large is actually gaining the least. So there seems to be an asymmetry in this data economy. And in the end of this masterclass, we will revisit this question with some empirical evidence from our own research here at HEC. So we discussed essentially so far why data matters. It funds digital media, it helps us to personalize content, but how does the system actually work? What happens if you go to a website? What happens behind the screen when you load a web page? So let's take a look. So user tracking is essentially the process of following a person over time online, connecting their browsing history. If you go to one website to another, if you visit an app to another app. So we can construct consumer profiles based on this system. And this entire system is facilitated by so-called identifiers. An identifier can be a cookie, a device ID, a login, something that says essentially that this user has been visiting a website yesterday. And every time you open a web page, bits of information will be stored about you and transmitted. For example, which site you have visited in the past, whether you saw an ad, whether you clicked on the ad, and whether you have purchased. Over time, this process will build a behavioral profile, a so-called digital fingerprint of your online activity. And of course, this information is very valuable for advertiser. So tracking isn't inherently bad. It enables personalization. It helps to target content recommendations to user. It helps to target ads to users. It creates cleaner user interfaces. So when I'm in Paris, I get targeted with weather information that refers to Paris and not London or New York, for example. But it also means that firms can follow you around. Everything you do, infer sensitive information, sell that data, and often without us as users being aware of this process. So in a nutshell, tracking funds digital advertising, but also is the source of many privacy concerns of users. So let's have a look at the online advertising market. Which players do we have there, and how does this process work? So in the center is user tracking. Publishers offer free content to us, let's say the New York Times, Le Monde, YouTube, and in exchange for offering this content for free, they have the ability to track users with cookies or device IDs. Publishers then pass on this information to advertisers who are interested in showing ads to these users. And eventually users will purchase, click on those ads and purchase products they are interested in or not, if targeting works very well. And of course, advertisers will also be interested in measuring the effectiveness of their ads. So this is the invisible barter economy that is taking place whenever you visit a website. And this keeps the online advertising industry alive. But of course, it also raises many questions. For example, how valuable is this market? Which types of data are most valuable? And how is this information in the first place being collected? So this is what we are going to study in this masterclass today. So when we talk about user tracking, we have to differentiate between two types of data. First type of data is data generated by user tracking. We call that user data. And this is data, for example, that shows what you have been doing on websites or apps. It's an identifier, like a cookie or a device ID, a login. But it's also information that is relevant for advertisers, but eventually also for users, because advertisers can use that information to think about how many ads to target to a user and how often you have interacted with an ad. So it actually prevents showing advertisers too many ads to the user. And these are also called behavioral variables. So we use those variables to target ads to you, but we also use these variables to measure the effectiveness of advertising. So this is user data, but there's also non-user data. This is data that is even available if user tracking would be banned. And this refers to information such as, for example, which publisher website are you actually visiting? Are you on a general news publisher? Are you on a sports publisher? Are you at a lifestyle publisher, for example? But it's also information, for example, whether this publisher is a premium publisher, like The Guardian in the UK, for example, or is it maybe a small blog in the north of France? So we have all this information available, and these factors together determine how valuable online advertising actually is. But the real game changer, the real multiplier, is user-level tracking. So this really makes a big difference for advertisers, but also for users and the quality of targeting ads to users. So why do advertisers care about this? Advertisers care about this because it reduces wastage. So advertisers have a fixed budget they want to spend on advertising. And of course, they don't want to put this budget to waste. So with user tracking, advertisers can actually target ads much better to users, to the specific segments that are interested in potentially purchasing products, but also targeting ads to users generally interested in those ads versus targeting everyone at the end of the day. So advertisers benefit from user tracking, but also publishers benefit from user tracking because they can get higher ad revenues and they can use this money to finance the free content that we all have become accustomed to. So these are, or is a first look at the trade-offs that we have to think about when we think about the system of user tracking. But of course, there's no free lunch. Users benefit because they get more relevant ads, they get free access to content, but they have to pay with their data. And often they pay with their data without knowing about this. And advertisers, of course, want to collect a lot of data about users. So let me give you a few examples. So users or advertisers want to know, for example, who are you? What is your gender? Where do you live? What is your home location? Where do you work? And all this information is, of course, valuable to target ads to you. But it's also interesting to know for advertisers, what are your interests? For example, are you interested in personal finance or are you interested in gardening, for example? Advertisers are also interested in your purchase intent, for example. Are you in the market for buying a new house? Do you have a medical condition, for example, and need a special treatment? Advertisers are also interested in what we call lifetime events. So for example, are you expecting parents? Are you getting divorced? Did you just get married? Do you have a chronic health condition? So all this information is really valuable, but it's also kind of privacy invasive for the users. And we will come back to these topics later on because it will also lead to a situation where the regulator potentially needs to step in. We'll discuss this later on in the session today. So who benefits and who bears the costs? Let's unpack the trade-offs a little bit more. So first of all, we discussed that advertisers benefit from user tracking. So they have less wastage. They can spend their advertising budget a little bit more efficiently. Publishers earn more revenues and they can spend this money on producing free content, and potentially even users benefit from user tracking because they get better content, they get targeted ads, but of course they also have to pay with their data, and in many cases users will not know about this. So we have been researching this topic here at HEC for quite a while, and I would like to share some of our results of this research with you to talk a little bit more who actually gains from user tracking and who loses. So in our research, we tried to answer this question empirically with data. So we have access to data of millions of ad impressions from 2 ad exchanges, which is a marketplace to sell online advertising. And these marketplaces are in the United States and in Europe. And essentially what we're trying to do here is we want to measure whether advertising with user tracking is more valuable than advertising without user tracking. So this is the goal that we are pursuing with this research. And interestingly, we found that in Europe, ads are 18% more valuable if user tracking is available. And in the United States, advertising is about 46% more valuable if user tracking is available. So what that means is user tracking is actually generating value in those online markets, and advertisers and publishers and potentially even users are benefiting from this fact. Importantly, there's also some nuance here. So not all data is created equal, and regulators typically want to restrict user tracking blanket, but it may make more sense to think about more targeted regulations, for example. So our research also shows that the data that you may think is actually the most intrusive, which is browsing history data, the data that shows what you have been doing in the past and is used to build your behavioral profiles, is not necessarily the most lucrative for advertisers, but for sure it's the most revealing and privacy infringing for users. So this is what we would expect a priori, but it turns out, and this is something our research found, is that identifiers, so a cookie, for example, a device ID, a login, is much more valuable for advertisers than the browsing history. And this is actually the case because the login or the identifier allows to re-identify a user. So we know that somebody who visits today actually came to the website yesterday, and this information is actually the most valuable in our data set. Turns out browsing history is actually not as valuable as this opportunity to re-identify a user. So this is very important to note because, of course, regulators are typically going after the most privacy infringing parts of data, not necessarily the most or least valuable to the industry. So this is something we should keep in mind and consider when moving forward with privacy regulation. So regulation is an important part of this industry. And of course, regulators have been interested in this topic for a long time. For example, in Europe, we have the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is kind of the flagship regulation in this area. We have in California the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, that proposes similar rules. And even in China, there is privacy regulation called PIPL, which imposes also consent-based rules to help protect consumers better against these practices that we see in the online advertising market. At the core of all these regulations is giving consumers more control over their data and allowing them a choice to release their data, to share their data with publishers and advertisers, or not share this data if they don't want to do so. So this is what's happening on the regulatory side, but there is also what we call industry self-regulation. This means that big tech players, such as, for example, Apple or Mozilla, or other potentially smaller players like DuckDuckGo, for example, they started to better protect consumers and make it part of their philosophy as a big tech firm. And examples of this is, for example, the App Tracking Transparency Framework, which better protects consumers on Apple devices. There are also other examples like Mozilla, which moved very early in the market to protect consumers and disallows third-party cookie tracking. But there's also similar protections, for example, in Safari available. So what this does is that some user populations get harder to reach online. And the online world, because of this, is getting more and more fragmented. So for advertisers, publishers, and potentially even users, this has severe consequences because, for example, advertisers, they could face a targeting problem. They cannot reach all consumers anymore. They also face a measurement problem. In addition, publishers earn less revenue, which potentially means less free content for users. And users, of course, are potentially better privacy protected, but they also lose the benefits of targeting content to them and personalizing content to them, which is also something we need to consider. So there is a trade-off here, better privacy versus less targeted content and information, which potentially may even benefit users. So I think this is important to note. What is also interesting here is, and we come back again to our research, is that not all publishers will be affected equally due to those restrictions of online tracking. For example, if you think about premium publishers like Le Monde in France or the New York Times in the United States, they are actually much less affected by restrictions to user tracking. They have very stable audiences, they have strong brands, and they can monetize this information better, not necessarily with advertising, but by selling subscriptions. So they have a really unique position to sustain these restrictions of user tracking that we are seeing more and more in the online advertising market. But there are also other publishers that are potentially hit harder due to those restrictions. And based on our research, these publishers are non-premium publishers. So not the New York Times or the Le Monde of the world, but maybe the Daily Mail or Reddit that also publish user-generated content. And it turns out that these websites are actually the ones that are most reliant on user tracking. So if you're restricting user tracking, you also have potential downstream consequences towards those potentially even smaller websites or user-generated content websites that have to suffer from these restrictions if you're restricting user tracking. And what is also important to note, privacy regulation can also have what we call market structure implications. So we already see that, for example, larger players are actually benefiting from privacy regulation, such as, for example, Google or Apple, versus smaller players. They are actually struggling with these regulations if you think about more like national publishers in France, for example. So this is something we need to consider when judging about restricting user tracking, who benefits and who gains. So let's summarize what we have discussed so far a little bit. So what are the trade-offs that we need to consider? So we talked about the benefits. So we saw that user tracking actually benefits publishers. We saw that it's more efficient for advertisers and that even users may benefit from user tracking because they get targeted information and targeted ads. But we also talked about the risks or the downside of user tracking. First of all, and most of all, users lose their privacy. Second, there can be fines, regulatory fines, if advertisers and publishers do not obey the law, for example, under the GDPR. There could be public backlash if there is a data breach, for example. And there is also this imbalance in market power between larger and smaller advertisers that we need to consider. And there's also one important point that we need to note here. That is, privacy regulation or privacy self-regulation is or can also be anti-competitive. So we also already talked about this a little bit, but let me give you one example. So one example is Apple's app tracking transparency framework, which sets out to protect consumers better on Apple devices. So for example, on your iPhone, you have better control over your data. But it also turns out that this restriction, which should help consumers, also hurts competition on the Apple ad system. So actually competitors are less able to advertise if under these new rules. And this brought in the competition regulator, such as in France, who fined Apple with about 150 million euros this year because of anti-competitive conduct due to these new privacy restrictions that they imposed on users. So this helps potentially privacy on those devices, but it hurts competition on the other side. So we really need to think of these new restrictions, not just in terms of privacy, but we also need to consider other downstream consequences, such as the impact on competition, for example. So what do we take away from all of this? What's the way forward? I think we can't, and probably we shouldn't, restrict user tracking completely. So what do we do? So I think the best idea would be to manage this responsibly. So we have to think about, first of all, which data is the most valuable that we are generating in this market, and which data is potentially the biggest or privacy harm, and which data maybe can we collect without doing any harm, but it's potentially very valuable for the industry. So I think this is something we need to think about. We need to be transparent about the use of that data relative and respectively to the user. And we want to give users real control about this entire process. So this shouldn't be a hidden process in the back end that we are not able to assess, but this should be a transparent process that everybody can see and judge for her or himself to think about whether they want to share their data or whether they do not want to do that. User tracking data is valuable. It benefits advertisers, it benefits publishers, it potentially also benefits users. What we need to do as regulators, as advertising industry, is to think about how can we actually balance these things and bring them together. We want firms to generate revenue, but we also want to protect consumer privacy in the end of the day. So to close the session, I would like you to think again how we started in the beginning. Who benefits from this trillion-dollar data economy and who pays the bill? This is what we need to collectively think about. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to answering your questions in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Klaus, for an engaging presentation on a really important topic, which has invited, I think, a lot of interest, and we certainly have had quite a few questions, and unfortunately we can only choose a few in the next 20 minutes. Just to clarify that data and data, it's just like tomato and tomato, they're both correct. David Desroses, to begin with, in France, he asks this question: does Europe's GDPR legislation create a competitive disadvantage by limiting the availability of historical data when it is an essential fuel, as I'm sure you're well aware of AI?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think there's a lot of discussion around this like privacy regulation may hurt the competitiveness of Europe, but on the other hand, it may also better protect European users and consumers. So I think it's really a societal decision that we have to make and think about how much tracking and data use do we want to allow to make firms more profitable, how much innovation do we want, and on the other hand, if you have more tracking, obviously we'll have less privacy, or are we going for another world where we say privacy is very important to us and we want to restrict what firms can do with the data? I think that's a big question we have to ask ourselves. And then there's a couple of other points you have to consider. For example, that historical data in some studies has been shown not to be particularly useful. So I think it really depends on the context that we are looking at. For example, if you're in the market for sports shoes, data 3 years ago will not be very valuable for advertisers. But of course, there are also other examples where historical data may be valuable. So I think we have to differentiate a little bit. GDPR also only protects personal data of users. So there can also be innovation based on privacy regulation. For example, new firms coming up, working with synthetic data, allowing firms to do what they have been doing, but at the same time protecting privacy of consumers. So it also sparks more innovation. And in the end, it's not clear to us what will happen. So we'll be observers on the sidelines to see what's coming out of this.
And of course, retention of data is limited in most countries to 3 years, I believe.
Yeah, there's this idea of data minimization. So you should only keep the data as long as it's necessary. But the law doesn't necessarily define what necessary means. It depends on the business you're doing. So for example, academic research, we have to keep the data forever. But if you're in a business context, you may only need the data for half a year or 3 months, for example.
And David follows up, actually. He says, how can we resolve this dilemma between compliance and competitiveness in the face of the innovation challenge?
Yeah, I think, as I said before, these regulations also spark new business models. So we see, for example, new search engines coming up that are privacy protective, that have a different business model. There are also ideas around asking consumers to pay for their privacy, which not many consumers do, but these business models are coming up. So consumers seem to prefer paying with attention instead of opening their pocket and paying out of pocket or with their credit card. So I think the industry is experimenting with these different options, and we'll see what happens in the future.
Very young industry. So this is a global masterclass, and so Vishesh in India sent this over. He brings up the question of strategic leverage, and he says that it's clear that it favors advertising, especially in smaller firms. Klaus, is this so?
Yeah, based on our data, we also see that advertisers actually benefit the most from user data because it allows them to better target their ads to users, which eventually purchase on their websites. We also see that publishers, for example, benefit to a lesser extent. What is also interesting, if you would restrict tracking, actually smaller firms would be hurt much more than larger firms, because if you think about big tech firms, they are in a better position to replace the data that they're missing if we restrict third-party tracking, and they can replace it with other data sources they have available.
There's Olivia who writes in from Canada, and she asks, how should firms design responsible user tracking strategies?
Yeah, there's a big discussion in the industry now about so-called privacy-enhancing technologies. So the basic idea here is to basically keep the utility of the data available for the firm and at the same time protect consumer privacy. There have been some initiatives, for example, in the area of ad targeting, like Google has been leading the pack here. They introduced the privacy sandbox, it's called. There has been some adoption of these technologies, but there's also discussion about whether users actually understand that they are better protected, whether this is actually helping. So the future will essentially show us which technology will be the new standard, so to say, for digital advertising. But we're also seeing these technologies in other areas.
Okay, and from Morocco, Ikram writes in, and she asks, what are alternatives to user tracking?
Yes, that's a good point. So that's basically a horse race, so to say. So if you restrict cookies, for example, the industry would move to digital fingerprints. If you restrict digital fingerprints, all websites would potentially ask you to subscribe and pay with your money. So it would also kind of restrict the amount of content providers that are available, because I think consumers will probably not want to subscribe to more than 5 or 6 services that we have already. So some of the smaller players will then have trouble to monetize at the end of the day. And then we would also have downstream consequences like less diverse media landscape, for example, missing those smaller platforms that we see in many countries, especially in Europe. So it's not fully clear if it's on the one hand side, we would be protecting privacy, of course, but you can have many downstream effects that we're not necessarily foreseeing at this point.
Speaking of consumers paying, there's Nelson who sends us this question from Tanzania. Could users pay for not being tracked?
Yeah, these options are available. Leading publishers, for example, in Europe call this pay or tracking walls. So we are working actually with some of these publishers on research projects here at HEC to find out what happens to the user base if you introduce these pay or tracking walls, how many users actually prefer to pay for not being tracked versus having the other option of still being tracked and paying with their attention. There's also discussion about is privacy becoming a luxury in the end of the day, because of course it's only the affluent users that can afford to pay for not being tracked. So it has also important downstream consequences to ask users to pay. But I think it's one pillar that we are seeing how users actually react and try to avoid tracking by using these pay or tracking walls, or for example by installing a tracking blocker on their side and not paying, for example, which of course also has consequences for publishers. So they will have less revenue to finance their content in the end.
Then we have this from Ricarte. He sends it from Santiago, Chile. He's wondering which types of data create most value with least privacy harm? Interesting question.
Yeah, that's also something interesting we found in our research. So essentially, when regulators talk about data, they usually say, okay, do we want to allow or not allow tracking? Do we want to ban it or not ban it? And that ban would, of course, affect all data. But what we see in our studies, for example, is that these identifiers that are also mentioned in the masterclass they have actually the highest value for the firms, but they are not very privacy infringing. And there are other data types like the browsing history that is used to build consumer profiles that is actually very privacy infringing, but it seems to not generate the bulk of the value of user tracking, so to say. So there may be an opportunity to have more targeted regulations. So instead of banning it completely, there may be a compromise to say, okay, we ban those data types that are very privacy infringing, but not necessarily very valuable for firms, and the other way around.
Okay, coming back to the HEC campus, there's Paul who sends this in from Juillan-Josas. What happens if you refuse to accept to be tracked? I mean, what information is still available to advertisers when user tracking is restricted? Kind of link these two.
Very good question. So advertisers would basically use the data connected to your identifiers, so basically the ID, your browsing history, but also information on how many ads you have seen, how often you have seen a specific ad. So this information is gone, but what remains is actually data that is not generated by user tracking, but your browser is automatically communicating. And this still allows, for example, to infer your location, your device, and things like that. And this can still be quite revealing, although maybe less revealing than what we would see if we have the actual user tracking data available.
So we have time just for one more question, and this is from Alain in Montreal, Canada. Where can viewers learn more about the impact of privacy regulation on the online advertising market?
Yeah, there's of course our book available, which we can also mention, I guess, at the end of the presentation, which could be interesting for readers to take a look and learn more about the online advertising market, how it works, how tracking works, how privacy regulation affects the market, and where the entire market is kind of developing based on what we see so far.
Okay. Well, I do encourage the viewers to get more information from Klaus's book, which came out quite recently, and you're continuing, I imagine, to do the research in a very new field. Huh?
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for. Thank you very much, Klaus Miller, who's one of our relatively 4 years, I think, that you've been on the HEC staff as a professor in the marketing department. Thanks to you for listening, and please do keep on sending your messages, more questions. Klaus will be happy to answer them. And join us next year for the further RESKILL Masterclasses. Until then, have a great end of year. Thank you, Klaus.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Creativity is a social experience. You're not creative alone.
Despite its struggles, ESG can overcome the criticism and help make companies more accountable towards all stakeholders.
Today we're going to talk about things like trust and teams.
Bitcoin, blockchain, cryptocurrencies,